You leave it on. But underneath it, there really high. I give folks a few more minutes because I suspect there are people making their way, hitting the bathroom, and that kind of thing. Sure. um, did Apple source directly in? Right. Be careful. You're going to be speaking. You're going to be. You're going to. Are we on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome back from lunch, everybody.
Pen, I think. Sean, do you have a pen? Do you have a pen? I
Here,
don't
you
have
can
it to my pen.
I'll share it
But
with you.
you're gonna need it.
I'll share it with you. Here. So, welcome back from lunch. My name is Steve Desposito. I run a nonprofit organization called Resolve. We work internationally on natural resource and human health issues. We really try to work with stakeholders who and identify issues where there's disagreements or there's space for a solution, and bring often unlikely stakeholders together to get a solution. And so I have the honor today of leading this, or convening this panel, and I'm lucky because the gentleman to my left, I know them all very well, and they're sitting in the, we're going to talk in the order that I know them over the years. So when I first started working on this issue of supply chains, we're talking about supply chains and responsible product certification, it was suggested that it would be impossible to do what happened in forestry or with cocoa or coffee with minerals. And I think as the panel talks today, we'll get a sense of how both that is a challenge to think about how to use supply chains for good with minerals, but there are also some interesting solutions, some of which are modeled directly off of other commodities and products, and some of which are quite different. So the panel, starting with Tim Martin, who's at the end. Tim and I have known each other for a couple of years now. Tim is going to focus today on the theme of resource diplomacy and peace building, using supply chains to help advance those themes and objectives. You've seen Tim's background, but key highlights. And I met Tim when he was still the Canadian ambassador to Colombia. He's the former. He's had a number of other very interesting posts in his career. And he runs a consultancy where he takes those diplomatic skills and applies them to places and to resources and to potential resources, the potential to use resources. And he's also a strategic partner of Resolve's, and he's leading the launch of a new initiative at Resolve called the Resource Diplomacy Initiative. Sasha Leshnev, who's to my left, I've known Sasha probably, I think, about 6 years or so. And Sasha leads the conflict minerals work for an organization, for an NGO called the Enough Project. And I look around the NGO landscape and I think about the impact that NGOs are having on issues. And I don't know, how big is the Enough Project, Sasha?
In terms of like how tall we are.
Yeah.
To 20, 25
Yeah.
people.
For a very relatively small organization, it's an organization that has tremendous impact and I feel really punches above its weight. And Sasha will be talking about the issues of rights, human rights and conflict. And he'll be talking in a very targeted way about a geography of concern, Central Africa, the Great Lakes region, and the work he's done on supply chains around that. And then the third, kind of last but not least, is Mr. Alan Young, who is going to talk in a broader sense about certification and supply chains. He's been involved in everything from forestry to mining, and he works with the Canadian Boreal Initiative, former executive director, now has a senior consulting policy advisor role. And I've been working on these issues, supply chain issues and other policy issues on mining with Alan for 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, it's actually closer to 20,
Yeah.
sure.
So welcome all of you. A couple things just to frame before we go to the panelists. Just interesting, perhaps, factoids about what's happening or what's happened in mineral supply chains in particular. Tiffany, the jeweler, knows and has known for many years where everything comes from in its supply chain for jewelry: the gold, the silver, the platinum, the diamonds. Newmont, who's here with us today, and Rio Tinto, for many years sourced, provided gold to Walmart for a jewelry line that was called Love Earth. Love, Earth, jewelry from the earth, a letter from the earth. You could actually go online as a consumer, plug in a number, and find out which mine your gold came from. If many Canadian diamonds, you can't see it without glasses or a magnifier, but there's a polar bear etched on the bottom of a number of Canadian diamonds. And Motorola Solutions, Intel, and Hewlett-Packard and other electronics companies are now sourcing conflict-free tantalum from DRC into their products. So they can hold up, they can't tell you that everything is in their product is so-called conflict-free, but they can hold up a phone or a product and say, we have conflict-free tantalum in this product. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what's happened by example in the sector. And so what I'd like to do now is starting with Tim, is kind of look back at some of the initiatives that have really taken place in the extractive sector and in other sectors, and really try to focus in a bit on what impact these initiatives are trying to have, and what is the strategy that they're trying to utilize? What is the supply chain strategy, and how is it working? So, Tim, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Steve, and I'd like to say thanks so much to the Getchus Wilkinson Center for inviting me here. It's great to be in Colorado. I am a proud graduate of Park Hill Elementary School in Denver, so it's good to be here. That was a little while ago. So I'll talk about the Kimberley process certification scheme, which broke the link between conflict and the diamond supply chain, and what we can learn from that today. I was chair of the Kimberley process in 2004 when it came into effect. Does the extractive sector connect to violence? Sometimes the answer is yes, and that's a historical reality, and it touches Canada. This is a protest sign against the Canadian company Talisman, which was producing oil on the front lines of the Sudanese civil war in the 90s. It was a big problem for our foreign policy as Canadians, and our foreign minister, Lloyd Axworthy, wanted to stop it. He commissioned an independent report. The findings of the report was this oil project, was exacerbating the conflict in Sudan, but had no legislative or policy tools to stop it. Ultimately, the Sudanese Presbyterian Church took it to court on genocide charges in the United States. The company responded to that pressure, got out of Sudan. Although it's interesting to note that it's Malaysian, Chinese, and Indian national oil companies that are working there now in the same place. Probably the most emblematic case of business and violence is that of blood diamonds and their role in the War of Sierra Leone. Blood diamonds testify to the incontrovertible historical reality of conflict minerals. The civil war in Sierra Leone lasted from 1991 to 2002. And to describe the horrific nature of this war, I'd like to read two excerpts from the findings of the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Commission finds that children were specifically targeted during the conflict. In particular, the Commission finds statistical patterns that are consistent with the hypothesis that children between the ages of 10 and 14 were targeted for forced recruitment, rape, and sexual slavery. The Commission finds that amputations were not a constant feature of the war, but rather came in the form of campaigns. At that time, this was a new kind of war in which the character and levels of violence completely exceeded any imaginable political objectives. But what was fueling it? What was making it continue and without stop? So the Security Council found in 2000, through an expert panel, that it was the sale of diamonds into the international marketplace through the Liberia of Charles Taylor that was the primary source of revenue for the rebels, who were the source of most of these atrocities. Estimates of the value of the diamonds sold to finance the RUF were $25 million to $125 million, but that was a time when an AK-47 was very inexpensive, so that money went a long way. And it was realized that there was an appalling policy contradiction festering at the heart of the international system. The international market could not tell the difference between blood diamonds and legitimate diamonds, and the international trading system was financing the war at the same time that the international community was mounting huge peacekeeping operations to try and keep a lid on it. The solution to the problem had to be global in character. And as a result, there were calls for a global certification scheme to break the link between conflict and diamonds. This was a system that was negotiated between governments, NGOs, and industry. And of course, it was NGOs that really took the lead by taking people out of their comfort zone about this terrible situation. Government certification of two specific transactions in the supply chain were what made the Kimberley process work. This was the export of rough diamonds and the import of rough diamonds had to be accompanied by certifications provided by the government that these diamonds are free of conflict. And it was implemented also through physical control of the rough diamonds, plus criminal penalties for exporting or importing non-certified diamonds. The system of emitting certificates went without a hitch at first, but a major problem, this was our problem because Canada was the chair of the KP at this time, was the problem of non-compliance. If the certified supply chain was contaminated, then once again, it was impossible to tell the difference between a good diamond and a blood diamond in the marketplace. For this reason, we needed to find the leaks in the system and fix them. The biggest problem was Congo-Brazzaville, which was the source of some $500 million of annual exports of, well, conflict diamonds, which they were smuggling from the Democratic Republic of the Congo next door. So what was the solution? We expelled them from the marketplace and made it a criminal offense for anyone in the market to trade with them. With the KPCS, we also, looking at it, in addition to breaking the link between conflict and diamonds, found that it had a number of other very important peace-building benefits. Conflict prevention, reduced threat of money laundering and the financing of organized crime, reduction of smuggling, increase in government revenues, which is very important in post-conflict situations, and increased formalization of the diamond sector. It did have a number of shortcomings as well. It did not recognize adequately the needs of small-scale artisanal producers, although parallel initiatives subsequently emerged. And the conflict diamond definition did not include human rights, an issue which came back to haunt the KPCS later. What can we learn about the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme in terms of future supply chain approaches? We can learn that the monitoring is critical. Having a supply chain certification or control system is one thing, but if you don't really know how it's working, if you don't really know there's compliance, then its credibility and integrity will erode. Penalties for compliance should be connected to market access. That was the approach in the Kimberley process, and it turned out to be highly effective. Don't squeeze the little guy. Supply chain approaches need to be inclusive of the small-scale, informal participants, or it will force them into illegality or force them out of the market when they need the income and employment. And I think also, face it, just as Governor Ritter was saying, the norms of when he was governor are different from they are today, and the expectations and norms move forward. They should move forward. As I said, human rights as an issue in determining conflict, defining conflict diamonds was not the case in 2004, but now human rights is critical in terms of determining what is a conflict mineral and what is not. Just going back and repeating something I said before, the core problem with blood diamonds was that the international trading system could not tell the difference between blood diamonds and legitimate goods. The certificates in this case made the difference real, visible, and consequential. Then the market got smart because it could see the difference. And I think an important lesson for supply chains is that smart markets can see and behave in accordance with the social and economic consequences that they generate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. So, Sasha, when we first met, I think it was at a meeting where the electronics industry was only beginning to sensitize itself and to understand the issue of minerals sourced from the Great Lakes region. And there was almost a phenomena, if I recall, of, wait, we're the good guys. We're making laptops and phones, and why are we being criticized for what we're doing? And it was very interesting. You stood up and spoke at that meeting. It's probably the first time many in the industry knew there was even an issue like this in their supply chain.
That was, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
That was a very interesting meeting. That was the first one, December 2008, and the companies had just started to investigate their supply chains for what what metals and what minerals are in there, and look how far we've come now. So anyway, first of all, thank you so much to the Getchus Wilkinson Center and Britt for organizing this. I think it's a very interesting panel, and for Steve for chairing this panel. Just 2 seconds on what Enough is. So the Enough Project is a project to work to try to end genocide and crimes against humanity. We focus on a couple of countries in Africa that we have expertise on. So Congo and the Great Lakes, Democratic Republic of Congo and the Great Lakes region, the Sudans, the conflict with the Lord's Resistance Army. We're starting to branch out into a couple more, Somalia, Boko Haram. So, and we combine research on the ground in these countries. We have field staff who are based out there with policy advocacy in Washington. So I'm based in Washington, go back and forth to Congo a lot. And then we after some experience of working with policy think tanks, where we would go into meetings, and then no one would, if people said, well, you have great ideas, but there's no political will to actually implement them, we decided to add on a campaign element to help build up that political will. So we work on 150 college campuses. In fact, CU Boulder was one of our first, the undergrads, and have a sort of a big student movement, and sometimes work with celebrities, etc. You may have seen recently that NFL quarterback Aaron Rodgers did an event with us. We continue to work with others on this campaign. So why are we concerned about Congo? After the Rwandan genocide, war spilled over into Congo in 1994. And it had been going on for 15 years, and standard diplomacy wasn't working. They would sign deals that would be torn up by rebels the next day. And one thing that we realized, having worked on the political analysis of this, is that based on a whole decade of UN group of experts reports, that the conflict actors, the governments, the armed groups were making hand over fist in profits from minerals by controlling mines and trading routes. 5.4 million people had been killed. The war had been going on for 15 years, and in particular, the armed groups, really devastated communities and women in particular through sexual violence. So we undertook a research project and said, okay, we really need to study what these minerals are, what products they go into, and the culmination of that research was that meeting that we had with the tech industry. We realized they were in our tech gadgets, right, in our laptops and our cell phones and our TVs, and this was something that was the engine of the conflict, according to the UN group of experts. So we sat down and we said, all right, let's try to learn the lessons of the Kimberley process and Blood Diamonds campaign. Let's try to learn the lessons of, forestry certification and other initiatives. And we really need to educate the public, first of all, about what these minerals are. Who's ever heard of wolframite, right? Well, I certainly hadn't. It turns out wolframite is tungsten. Well, people know tungsten, at least a little bit. It's in your light bulbs, right? Gold was one of the minerals. That was not made clear at all, and many people didn't know that it went in eventually into electronics. Tin, for example, a lot of people don't know the majority of the world's tin actually goes into solder, which is used for electronics, 53%. Very interesting fact. Most people think of tin, it's like a tin can, right? But in fact, most cans are not tin, they're aluminum. It's something we learned. So, following some good advice from our friends who were branding experts, they said, when you educate the public on this issue and you go and talk to executives and companies, you're not going to get consumers to not buy their products. It's not about them selling fewer products tomorrow. But you can affect their brand reputation, and so consumers' psychological perception of these companies, right? And if I remember, we were working on a legislative strategy, and there was an issue of a magazine that everyone reads on Capitol Hill, Congressional Quarterly, and there was a BlackBerry with blood, dripping out of it. It was a very powerful image, and sure enough, the next week, BlackBerry wrote in right away to say, "Oh, we support the legislation." So if you can affect the brand perception, that was very important. So we thought our strategy was two-pronged. So number one, to educate the consumers and the companies so that they can have an impact on the supply chain. And the supply chain for minerals looks like an hourglass. Sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint, but at the top you have many electronics companies and other end-user companies, and at the bottom you have thousands of mines. But in the middle you have the choke point, which is the smelters, the companies that heat up the rocks and turn them into metal, more or less. And if those companies know where they get their minerals from. So if you can get the Apples and the Intels and the Nintendos to have those smelters, first of all, find out who they are, because a lot of companies didn't know, and then secondly, to audit those smelters in a credible process and force them to disclose where they're getting their minerals and having a cross-check of that, then that could have a real impact, because those are the companies that were ordering the conflict minerals, literally, from Congo. And then the second part of it was a legislative requirement. We knew that we could probably meet some CEOs. We could probably meet some CEOs who would be friendly and work on this issue, but that wouldn't get every company. So we wanted to have a mandatory requirement, and that was a lesson from other work as well. I had worked on the Publish What You Pay campaign, and we were pushing for a mandatory requirement as well. And so the idea was to influence smelters with that goal. So what happened? So the companies ended up setting up an audit process. It's called the Conflict-Free Smelter Program, CFS. And it was set up in 2009, 2010. Steve was helping advise on it from the beginning, and Resolve. And we helped provide some guidance just based on our knowledge of the supply chain in Congo and the region. And there are roughly 200 smelters worldwide overall for these four minerals: tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, or 3 T's in gold. So today, 5 years after the program was literally just, when pen was put to paper, 135 out of those roughly 200 have actually passed these conflict-free audits. It's pretty phenomenal revolution, I think, in the supply chain, in supply chains worldwide, I would say. And many of these companies are actually, the vast majority are based outside the United States, which is even more interesting, I think, like including some 18 Chinese smelters. The legislation ended up passing. It was page 562 or something like that of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill. And just last year was the first filing deadline for companies to actually report on their sources of these minerals, and 1,305 companies reported. It's pretty phenomenal. So thankfully we didn't have to go to 1,305 boardrooms. We could have Congress say, please do it. That was helpful. So in Congo, we're starting to see progress and results from this. This is a very long process. It's a very complicated process. Of course, there's smuggling loopholes, and it's a tough battle. But as of today, 2/3 of the mines for tin, tantalum, tungsten are conflict-free, which is a pretty phenomenal achievement, seeing as where we were 5 years ago. And the influence of the armed groups themselves is decreasing. There are still armed groups out there, but there's no Rwandan-backed armed group. There's a Rwandan Hutu armed group, which is a quarter of the size of it was 5 years ago. Several other armed groups are decreasing in influence. And so, what's needed now? Because the situation is not over for sure. And we can't stop here. This was only one part of the overall strategy. So I would say 4 things are important to implement now. Number one is to actually have responsible investment in Congo. We never would have advocated for that 5 years ago. Steve, you're going to lean on me to stop. I'll be very quick. Because there were no laws in place to govern those types of investments. So now, if you invest in Congo and you source minerals from Congo, you must declare where you're sourcing from and if those are conflict mines or not. And there's a process which we can talk more about. And that's, that investment should happen both from mining companies as well as fair trade artisanal mining groups. Secondly, we need to work more on gold. Gold is more easily smuggled, and we need to have a process to formalize the artisanal trade and close some of those smuggling loopholes. Thirdly, we need to have better projects for miners themselves. As Tim mentioned, don't hurt the little guy. We need to do more to help the little guy. With livelihood projects and investment projects. And lastly, in an interesting kind of area, there need to be some consequences for criminality that has been happening. And so we are starting a new initiative on the war crime of pillage. Pillage is actually a war crime. If you steal natural resources in the context of an armed conflict, you're actually in violation of the Geneva Convention. So, and this has been very underappreciated, under-prosecuted, and so the International Criminal Court and other courts need to start working on this war crime of pillage. So I've probably gone double my time. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Thank you.
You're good. So really, the little guy, is the key part of the story for both what Tim was talking about and Sasha was talking about. This is small-scale mining, largely. And in fact, there's a look toward the large-scale mining companies as potential partners in the future development in these regions, and there's an interest in attracting them, at some point. So, but Alan, you and I, when we first started working together, it was really thinking about the large-scale companies and having done a lot of work looking at how you could improve practice at the mine site, how communities could have more of a say, feel more, there was more accountability, and we felt like we weren't succeeding, and so that, on a mine site basis, so led to some discussions where we started talking about what about other strategies.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that and to bring into my comments, we'll focus just at a little higher level on the development of these tools and some of the differences between them. But I think Steve and I were in a similar place in the late 90s, I guess, where there had been a lot of protests, a lot of problem identification. We knew what was wrong, but it was really hard to get people to say what was right. And our problem that we had was that it said, well, if we just tell them what not to do, then they get to say what's good enough. And it was a really interesting battle within the civil society organizations to get them to sit down and say, so what would a good mine look like? And people were terrified of having that, and resistant for a whole variety of reasons, and some of them fairly legitimate. But I think we knew in our bones that if we didn't become part of articulating what a good mine looked like, we would always be in a reactive place, and we'd never be able to move this thing forward. But there wasn't a lot of space at that time to have that conversation. So that was really a strong inspiration for us. This was all evolving in the context of a strong deregulatory environment in Canada and the US. There was major budget cutbacks in what had otherwise been a relatively robust regulatory system. We were losing inspectors and permitters and things like that. So there was a lot of things happening. The other element of that was that there's a huge influx of capital from the high-tech markets that was going in to drive an internationalization of the mining sector everywhere in the world, and a lot of that was Canadian. So we were having this flood of money out of Canada, which then brought pressure on Canada to lower its standards. And it was a very complicated working environment, and we did a number of things at that time. One thing that we did was do a lot of work internationally with folks in the Andean region and others to try and understand what mining companies were doing there, compare notes, and try and develop kind of a solidarity network around that. But the other thing we did was start to follow the money. And as a friend of mine said, if you want somebody's attention, don't talk about their values, grab their wallet. And he actually said kick their dog, but I never quite liked that one. But grabbing their wallet was a smart idea, but we realized how little we understood about the people that we were trying to change the behavior of. And that was the start of a series of rather odd investigations and meetings where, you know, we'd be talking to the mining industry about profits and shares and values, and they'd be talking to us about bears and bugs and rivers. And this started this process of exchange on, okay, so what values are you trying to protect? And is there any way that the crossover on this could translate into something of mutual recognition and mutual value? And those are the early stages. And I think we kind of were forced into this situation of collaboration because the problems were becoming increasingly complex, and that and we found nobody was driving the bus, really. I mean, an industry couldn't act alone, and an NGO or a community can't act alone, and the governments were absent, if unhelpful in many cases. So literally no one was driving the bus. And so, you know, our mantra, you know, put a hand on the wheel, put a foot on the brake. You're gonna, if you want to avoid going over the cliff, we're all gonna have to drive this thing. And that was a really interesting revelation, I think, and it continues to be true as the landscape evolves. But for the industry, I mean, there's been some fairly interesting studies come out on the business case for this kind of collaboration, but when we put it to one of the companies that we were working with, said, like, why are you in this? Do you want to develop a mutually acceptable system so that you can get a bump in your share price? Do you want it because you want preferential access to markets? Do you want it because you're going to retain employees and attract employees better? Are you expecting a premium on your commodity? Or do you just want sort of the conflicts to go away? They went away and thought about it for a number of months, and they came back and said, well, all those other things would be nice, but it's the delays to major projects that are killing us. They came back and said it was $2 million a day was what their estimate was. Recently, there was a study out of the University of Queensland, I think it was co-published with the Harvard School, that estimated major projects being those $3 to $5 billion. The cost of delay is $20 million a week. So it doesn't take long to do the math on why adopting a system that would avoid those delays by collaborating with people who can, you know, increase the credibility and increase the effectiveness of your planning and preparation might pay off pretty quickly. And that was a surprise to me. But it's real. It's like they're not looking, I mean, some of the good people in the room and that we worked with and who continue to be part of this are interested in doing the work, but they have to save money or make money for the company, and there is increasingly this very compelling business case to avoid conflict and avoid delays. So that's been very interesting, and part of that's just a function of the interconnected world, an informed world, one in which there is a lot more immediate feedback from the issues, and there are things that we probably know before the mine managers know, or certainly before the executives know, and that's a pretty scary situation to be in. So, those are sort of the conditions of collaboration, which has, I think, forced us to look at it. And when we are looking, when I look at the systems that I've been working with, I look to third-party, independently verified assurance systems as being easily the most effective. You've got some second-party ones where, you know, say an industry association defines the standards, brings some advisors, and manages that. And that does a lot of good, but there's a real plateau on the return on value for that. It can be as expensive to implement, but simply the credibility and the return on value is not there. You don't get the trust, you don't get the latitude. The third-party ones like FSC are a model that is much more rigorous and robust in terms of its assurance to communities, and therefore the access to the resource and the ongoing avoidance of conflict. And so those are those elements of sitting down together, jointly developing a risk profile, jointly developing your understanding on the life cycle and where the problems and obstacles in the life cycle and the chain of custody are, jointly designing efficient and effective auditing and monitoring protocols, and agreeing on the critical issues around intellectual property and brand protection, so that you can, when somebody sees something like the check tree for FSC, they know that what they're getting is actually real. And there's an unbelievably complicated set of structures that need to go around that. I chaired the FSC Canada board for a number of years, and the number of property rights and intellectual property lawyers that we did battle with over the years was just scary. And manuals this thick on this stuff, but it was all part of protecting the assurance of the brand. So we kind of look at that, and you don't want to make things overly complicated, but I think, to paraphrase one of my favorite Einstein sayings, things should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And these systems are not simple. They're not light, but if they return the value, then they stop the bleed of $20 million a week, and they stop, irrevocable harm to communities. So it's worth investing in, and I'll talk later a little bit more about one of the systems I'm working on with the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. But I think the good news and the bad news is that these systems cannot be imposed unilaterally. They have to be co-created, co-designed, and co-managed. And that governance shift is, in and of itself, I think, underestimated how profound it is and the implications it will have. Because I think forcing people into that room to listen to one another, to actually jointly decide these things and to make compromises on both sides is something that's relatively new. And it happens in some very surprising places. And I think that in and of itself is something that's worthy of more study and more value in terms of the ripple effect that will have. Lots more I could say. I think I'll leave it at that. I just want to say that there is the problem of scale. These things are good, but they're not nearly big enough. And I just came from a meeting in London where the ISEAL, the International Standards, Social Environmental Assurance Labeling Standards group, was there, and the big and slightly depressing take-home message was that all this sort of ethical market stuff is great, but until it hits the BRIC countries, and until it becomes part of the whole engine of China and Brazil and India, it's about 5% of what we need. So it's a good model. It's interesting. It's very potent. It's dealing with billions of dollars. But in order to realize its potential, it's going to have to be significantly scaled up. And that's a challenge we might want to talk about.
So Tim, I want to come back to you and just for a minute talk a bit about how you're taking the lessons and applying them in a new initiative in Colombia.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Yes, first I'd like to just describe a little bit the concept of resource diplomacy that we're working on. And that's the idea that voluntary multi-stakeholder interventions across the length of a supply chain can be organized to improve the social, security, and development performance of the natural resources sector. When I was in Colombia, there were two data points that were really striking and puzzling. It was a big problem for Canada. One was illegal mining. And I don't know if people know this, but there's an ongoing, long, 50-year-old armed conflict in Colombia. There's two protagonistic illegal armed groups, the FARC and the ELN. And after cocaine, the most important source of income for them is illegal gold mining. So it's a big security problem in Colombia. And another issue that we faced was the Canadian gold mining companies who were coming to develop formal projects in Colombia found that on their concession were informal miners who'd been there for generations, hundreds of years maybe, who were very vulnerable and preyed on by these illegal miners. So we've been working to develop a solution for this problem that includes formalization according to the standards of the OECD due diligence for minerals in conflict-affected countries through training and capacity building in partnership with a Colombian organization, connect that with large-scale mining companies that are working on the formal side, so it's not a zero-sum game of competition for a resource that one side will win and another side will lose, but that they have a model for working together. And then connecting that with downstream companies, Apple, Motorola, others have been interested in this, to find a transparent, tracked and traceable supply chain from Colombia that will provide a window for the little guy to the global market in partnership with the formal firms. So we think that's going to be a good model to solve that problem, to squeeze out the illegal armed groups from the gold industry, give opportunity to small-scale miners, provide capacity building for their safety, health, and environmental standards, and make it workable with formal development of the gold sector, which Colombia needs for fiscal purposes and development purposes to continue moving forward.
Thanks, Tim. And Sasha, you take a minute on the complementary activities that, in addition to calling for transparency and supply chain knowledge, right, you looked at what else is needed in the region from a development point of view. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to not just have the hammer, but you need to have the carrot, I guess. I mean, the hammer has been the transparency, that we have to have more transparency and more better supply chain systems from the companies. But on the flip side, you have to have benefits on the ground that, you know, will make people want to participate in a conflict-free system. So starting with Motorola Solutions about 4 years ago now, they went to Congo, visited some mining areas. They weren't directly in the conflict area, but, you know, right next door in the province directly to the south, and discovered some tantalum mines that they thought, okay, maybe we can set up a supply chain system to source directly from there. And that has been very successful. It's called the Solutions for Hope program, and many other companies have joined in that initiative, Intel, BlackBerry, others. And what that is basically a program whereby you're cutting out middlemen who were, in a lot of cases, the very corrupt, exploitative actors to the miners, and having a direct supply chain. So you have it's 4 steps. So the miner, the exporter, the smelter, and then directly to the end user company. And you can trace it all the way through, and that improves the prices for the miners. And
At the pump, so to speak, at the source.
exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So, you know, in some cases, the price for the miners has gone up 2 or 3, as much as 10 times from what they were earning before, which is great. So what we need now is to try to implement that in the parts of Eastern Congo that are more difficult, and they are starting to try that, but and we need something like that for gold as well.
Yeah. So these guys, Alan, are solving for these particular regions, and then around a kind of discrete, complex set of issues, but, you know, limited sphere. Can you talk a little bit about the initiative you've been involved in, where you're looking at kind of the broader set of questions around mining and sustainability and responsible mining?
Yeah.
For just a few minutes, and then we're going to go to question.
So yeah, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance was something that Steve and I helped to launch as an exploratory set of discussions with the industry. We also had quite a range of other players. There were, in those early games, the electronics folks were there. There were some insurance underwriters. It was a really interesting group, but Tiffany's was certainly a leader. Newmont played a big role in developing a lot of the standards and the systems as it went along. And then groups like Earthworks, Oxfam, Western Shoshone Defense Project actually is another group that's been heavily involved. And so we've been working for, well, I say 8 years, but that's probably an underestimate, through various forms of leadership and experiments to look at an international system, internationally applicable system, which follows the premises that I described earlier. The idea is to, you know, bring together under one roof a consolidated, integrated set of standards that would give you the equivalent of the FSC check tree. 'Cause part of the problem we're trying to solve for is that there's a lot of different standards out there. Some of them are second party, some of them are third party. The cyanide code is a great example of something that was really one of the best things that's come up and is workable, and that's just basically bolted onto the IRMA system. It's like, yep, that's great, you got that, you get that check, but there's other things to do around transparency. There's other things around labor standards, and as much as possible, one of the principles of developing this stuff is to use the good stuff that's there, and where it's not there, or whether what's there, where what is available is not good enough, scale it up to the appropriate standards, so that at the end of the day, you've got full set of standards that importantly include free prior informed consent protocols, and that with that you can ideally have with confidence, you could go to a community, go to a government, go to whatever and say, we are going for an IRMA certified mine, in the way that you would say, we are going to build a LEED certified building. So we're at a stage now where we work to get a complete set of standards out and are doing them according to this ISEAL. People here at all aware of the ISEAL Alliance? It's so it is a London-based NGO which is sort of certifies the certifiers. So basically, if you look at Fair Trade or the Marine Stewardship Council or the Forest Stewardship Council, they're all, if not governed, then certified by this overall standards body, so that you know that the development of the standards and everything else is going to comply with a standard of quality. And you know, if you're an ISEAL certified standard, you get, if you're of a higher body. So we've gone through our first round of international consultations, got some 1,300 comments, which I'm going to London next week.
Are you still reading?
We're still reading, yeah. And we've got a team, a collaborative team. So there's NGOs, jewelers and downstream users, like Microsoft is there, and some others, and of course companies, to find the solutions to these challenges. And we are hopeful that we will get there.
So I want to
There's
take
a lot
that.
of work to do.
I want to take that point up, and I want to pull out another issue that's you've touched on. I mean, my recollection is that when these systems started, we were talking about consumers driving change through supply chains. It seems like that's not, except in isolated cases, truly the driver. But you have, all of you, I think, refer to leadership, and that could be in the NGO sector, it could be in the corporate sector. How important is corporate leadership to driving these systems forward? Is that a critical leverage point, A? And then B, compromise, right? So what happens when you don't get everything you want? Now, I remember negotiating this criteria we used for Walmart, Love Earth. That was pretty painful exercise, but there was compromise. How does one take that back into, and how does one work through the compromise piece? Did you have to in any of the work you're doing? Do you anticipate having to? And then we'll open up for questions.
Well, yeah, leadership is critical, and one of the things that's become obvious over the years is that, for all that companies complain about communities being unstable and there's always shifting, we've been through many CEOs, and some of those CEOs change, and there is a consistency in company policy. Some, it changes quite radically, and then you're subject to commodity shifts. So leadership is critical, and holding the line on values is critical. And the concern I have with these voluntary systems is that they are unstable in terms of the management. So it's a weakness of the system. They're voluntary, and if the next CEO doesn't like it, they abandon it. Now, you want to build the system so it's strong enough to create those incentives, but the leadership is critical, the vision is critical, because there's a huge amount of pressure from your peers not to do this. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the things. And the other point about the consumers not driving this is
but to talk about the issue of compromise and what happens when you don't get everything you want in a system like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the question, and we've been going through this right now with a series of engagements with stakeholders, with our peers in the civil society and Indigenous communities, and we're getting a fair bit of heat for it. And two things. One is say, well, if we don't get a system as whole through, we are left with the status quo. Would you like an imperfect system that is a lot better than what you've got now, or do you want a perfect system that won't fly, and you're left with the unworkable status quo. Will the perfect be the enemy of the good? And are you happy with the status quo? And so the compromises are there, and we just need to identify the critical threshold. Like, this is a showstopper, and that is not. And we're right in the middle of discussing that.
Okay. And then about Tim or Sasha, anything from your experience with KP or from Dodd-Frank? Is everything in KP? Is it something where you didn't get not everything, there are fixes still needed in KP?
Well, the KP failed to include human rights as a consideration when it was evident that the diamonds were coming from Zimbabwe, being mined by the government under situations that were just unacceptable from a human rights. And I think the problem was everybody got too comfortable. And unless companies and governments have a dose of fear that they will lose their credibility and be subject, even worse, to other more formal sanctions, you don't get movement. That tension needs to be there. In terms of leadership, I think there has to be convergent leadership, where you have leaders from the private sector, leaders with a vision from NGOs, and leaders from government who can work together. But governments don't always feel comfortable authorizing their senior officials to get around that table and do the business, is an observation I'd have. But leadership needs to be convergent.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would. You promised that you were going to add some surprise questions, so I see you're whipping out your arsenal now, Steve. So
you're good after this one.
That's fine. Yeah, I really think that the consumer angle is really the backbone of the whole thing, right? I mean, Congress never would have passed this bill had they not thought that consumers were really interested in it. In fact, activists were instrumental in certain points of the legislation. There was some senators who were blocking things, and we had our activists bombard their Facebook page, and the next day the senator would turn around. So so I think that was really important, and the perceptions. I mean, I think this whole transparency movement of trying to understand, of consumers wanting to know what's inside their products. That is the future, right? And we're seeing this on college campuses all the time. We talk to these kids; they really want to know what's inside. And we get calls from other groups who are like, well, we want to do, open up an iPhone entirely and investigate every part of the supply chain. So we'll talk to you about the conflict part, and then we'll go to China and deal with the labor issue. And sure enough, somebody's built a fair trade phone now. It's a fair phone built in the Netherlands. So I think that that both some of the company executives and the legislators saw that, and they're like, well, we want to ride the wave forward in the future. I do think that company leadership is really important, particularly if you can get some of the big companies in a very competitive environment. So we're seeing the benefits of that. For example, Intel announced last year the first ever conflict-free product, fully conflict-free product. It's a microchip. And sure enough, we get calls the next day from a whole range of companies saying, well, we're about to make our conflict-free product, but what exactly do you want? And so they're seeing that competitive aspect, which is cool. That's sort of our intention to begin with.
So Britt, if it's okay, can we go a little longer, maybe 5 or 10 minutes since we started a bit late, and take some questions at this stage, and the floor is open.
So that was a specific kind of a company initiative, so Motorola Solutions and some partner companies there, and I think they wanted to make a longer-term investment in the resources rather than just receiving little shipments from artisanal miners here and there. They wanted to have a longer-term deal for stability of supply and that kind of thing. Part of it was they didn't take over all the mines, so those middlemen could also go elsewhere. There was other opportunities. There's another. They have set up Solutions for Hope 2, now in another area of Eastern Congo. And the strategy there was to actually kind of consolidate the middlemen into the mine so that the miners would be selling to the middlemen and the middlemen would be selling out rather than cutting them out altogether, because we knew that the middlemen were very much in bed with the armed groups. So, and that was a more dangerous situation. So if you cut them out entirely, you'd probably have rebels attack your mine the next day. It's not very constructive. So it's still to be seen. There's a lot of tension around that one. But I think that that's a really important aspect, and I don't know how it's being done in Colombia, for example, but that's one that we're closely considering on gold. Like, how do you deal with these largely, illicit smugglers who were the middlemen?
There's some really interesting legal work being done on that, and my partner in business and my wife, she does that. She's an expert in the legal aspects of this, and so she's written a piece for UNEP on the formalization of small-scale mining, and so the legalization and formalization. So there's some really interesting materials that I know that she's accessed and she's written about that talks about some of these things are embedded in misguided legal and policy frameworks that put real restrictions on the ability of small-scale miners and artisanal miners to market their products. And so a lot of the work that's going on, the formalization and legalization, is to get them credit, give them sufficient title, and allow them the strength and the latitude from a legal perspective, from a corporate entity perspective, to conduct business. And the problem is that as an informal body, they often are incapable, or it is illegal for them to transfer gold. So some of these things are a market-based and sort of culturally based. Some of them are actually embedded in law, which is quite capable of being changed and is the subject of some really interesting work that's going on now.
Any other questions? Dave?
Steve, I think you made a really important choice about model driven by many of the interface between retail and consumer, which basically said we don't have any conflict of interest. It was really the compromise on the standards, because you have to touch down and touch up. It was really the standards that went into that expected behaviors were built on that. But that value, while important, is really limited at this point to getting these things to. You didn't put conflict, and that was more on the land side, an increase in reputation, which really translates into better access to capital improvements. Those aren't all the key issues you touched on.
Yeah.
How do you see leveraging this incredibly successful work into some of those more challenging areas that aren't necessarily in that zone of comfort and compromise, but are much more contagious around the fringe? How would you leverage that?
And as an example, just to build on that for a second, the electronics companies are being asked now, okay, you've de-risked your supply chain for conflict from DRC. What about social environmental? That's the electronics companies are being asked that by NGOs. And so what does that world look like? Moving from discomfort to discomfort. I don't think any of it's comfort, perhaps, unless you enjoy a good struggle. But Sasha?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, we're advocating for responsible investment now, and what does responsible mean, right? Well, I guess Alan's in charge of defining it, so we'll. But so we put out a paper last year trying to, based on international standards that were out there on social, environmental, community issues, and how companies could invest in Congo, in particular, in the Great Lakes region. We call it doing good while doing well. That was the concept, and it is complicated. I think what we want to try to do is help build some of the consumer movement to support responsible investment, and say, well, if companies fulfill some key requirements, then you can support initiatives rather than just be anti-investment. It does get a little tricky from the NGO standpoint, I will say. Like, there's some fracturing there to say, well, you guys are supporting companies now? Like, I thought you just ranked and spanked companies, right? So, or now we're thanking them. So, rank, spank, and thank. So I don't know. I look forward to the IRMA process and what they come out with.
Well, just on IRMA, the couple things we chose not to do is we're not dealing with coal, we're not dealing with uranium, and we're not dealing with other sort of fuel-based commodities. And that was just a political choice. So if we carry that baggage on top of everything else, like, it's not going to be possible to get this out. It's not going to start a system. And so we're trying to strike that balance of what's manageable on the key issues and then evolve over time. I mean, it's interesting, FSC now, they've just taken on FPIC into the Forest Stewardship Council. They knew that that was something that they weren't strong enough before, and they're doing an international principles and criteria around free, prior, and informed consent. So these things will, as the issues evolve and are articulated internationally, the systems have to evolve to adapt them, but it comes back to that perfect being the enemy of the good. I think we need to get something out there, try it, have everybody take the risks, and then build it up from there.
And some of it's quite different too, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to say, parts per million of X can't be released from this site. It's another thing to say, what is it that you do on the ground to achieve FPIC? Those are two very different considerations. I mean, the checklist for, controlling waste is one thing. The checklist for reaching an agreement with indigenous communities about resources is a whole other thing with less rules to the road.
Yeah.
So it seems to be a harder standard to write, it would seem. Tim, what about you on that question?
Well, one of my recent jobs was in southern Afghanistan. And for countries like that, emerging from a terrible conflict, companies and natural resources are going to be key. And I think we can get to a place where it's not just downside risk of natural resources projects in terms of security and human rights and conflict. There's upside risk when these things are done properly, and there's proper conflict and human rights assessments and strategies from the outset as projects are developed. And I think that touches on what you're saying a little bit, Sasha, too. It's not just a negative downside risk, but there's positive contributions. And for countries to recover, they need this investment. So I think it would be interesting to start looking for those upside positive aspects of doing things right in difficult situations characterized by armed conflict.
Right. Well, I want to thank the panelists, and I want to close by saying that 20 years ago, this conversation wasn't happening, the discussions weren't happening across sector. They are now. If nothing else, that's an advance and a significant advance over the last 15, 20 years. And you're starting to see results, and I want to thank you all for being part of the panel and for the work you've done. Thank you.
Thanks.